Hi everyone, my name is Anu Narayan-Swamy. I work with the Sunlight Foundation's reporting group, and we have a couple of people on the webinar today. There's Lindsay Young, who's the reporter who's worked on the return on investment package that you can see on the reporting side. We're also joined by Kathy Kiley, who's our managing editor, and Liz Bartholomew, who is with our communications shop. Couple of things about the webinars that we're doing. This is part of Sunlight's, one of the tools that Sunlight is doing right now. It's part of Sunlight Academy, and you can find a couple of the webinars we've done in the past on this site. All through the year we've been doing these. We had several on campaign finance, covering super PACs and outside spending, so you all should feel free to go and check back on some of these webinars. And we'll probably be doing a few more before the inaugural season in January using our Party Time site. This will be about a 30 to 40 minute presentation, and feel free to ask us questions, interrupt and ask us questions if you have any. You can also type in any question you have, and all the presenters can see the chat window, so we'll be able to answer you that way too. Anything else? I'm going to turn over to Lindsay, who's going to do part of the presentation, and others will just jump in as and when.
We're looking at the return on investment for independent expenditure groups for the 2012 general election. So we're going to explain what return on investment is and how we calculate it. We're going to show you some new data sets that were released today. We have Congress-only numbers, House-only numbers, and Senate-only numbers. We're going to review some of the findings. We're going to give you some story ideas, and anytime along the way, feel free to ask questions. So what is return on investment? The way we calculated is that the percent of money in that election that went towards the desired result. So supporting candidates that won or opposing candidates that lost. We only looked at the general election for the spending numbers because primary spending is a lot more complicated. Sometimes you're just trying to spoil the other opponent. And we used the data from Follow the Unlimited Money. And you can get a line item of all the individual transactions at Follow the Unlimited Money. To do the calculation, it's rather simple in theory. You just put all the money to oppose losing candidates and all the money to support winning candidates and divide that by general election spending. But to figure that out, you have to figure out who won and who lost and go through many, many records. So we do that for you. And that was the story that we had that we've been continually updating. And you can see the new story right here. We have the big percent, which is the return on investment. So that's the general election, and it's all congressional, House, Senate, and presidential. Then you can see the Congress, which is House and Senate, House and Senate. If they didn't spend in a House race, then it will be replaced with NA, or if they didn't spend in Congress at all those subtotals will be NA. And then you can see the differences when you take out the presidential spending, that the SEIU went down and then if you look at Americans for Tax Reform, you can see that they did really well in the House. So these are stories that are buried a little bit deeper that you can't tell with the general percentage. But I would like to take you through the data itself. One of the email for the reminder, we sent out 2 data sets, and the first one I'm going to open is called our Org Stats All. So if you have that, you can follow along. I'm going to switch to a desktop view, and you should be able to see my desktop shortly. and I'll give a minute for that. The first thing I want to do right now is I'm just going to sort by general election funds, and I'm going to in descending order so we can look at the top spenders and how they fared. I'm just going to go quickly through what the different data titles mean. Committee name is the name of the independent expenditure group. Lots of them are super PACs, but not all of them. The FEC ID is going to be helpful if you want to look up the original FEC records. General election spending, that's how much we have calculated that they have spent in the general election. Money to support winning candidates is pretty self-explanatory. So is money to oppose losing candidates. And money that did not produce the intended result is everything else. So that's opposing winning candidates and supporting losing candidates. The number of candidates mentioned is the number of candidates in the general election that they identified on their independent expenditure forms. The number of supported candidates that won, then we have the number of opposed candidates that lost. Finally, we also tallied the spending in the primary or other election. Sometimes there's a special election, and that spending all goes in there. So you can find the total for the election cycle by combining the primary spending with the general election spending. But for our calculations, we only use the general election spending. So the ROI right here is just our return on investment, and that's calculated by adding the money to support winning candidates with the money to oppose losing candidates and putting that over general elections spending. The congressional ROI is that subset of data for Congress. House ROI, the same calculation, but just for the House. Senate ROI, same calculation. But if you see the NA records, those aren't applicable because they didn't spend in the general election for that category. You can see with House or congressional only that the congressional to ROI isn't going to change. If they're only presidential, everything else is going to be NA. So priorities or restore our future is going to be in that category. The other spreadsheet that I wanted to go over today is called the IE stats. And I like to organize this data by committee name and then the amount spent in the general election. So I'll reorganize that real quick. And this is where you can really dig into the data. The first line is the total spent in the general, and that means that committee spent that much on that particular candidate in the general election. The committee number is, again, very useful if you want to look up the original filings on the FEC. Sometimes there's mistakes, so it's always good to double check if something doesn't make sense. We find some mistakes and we correct them as soon as we can. So you can see there, the super PAC, no if it's not a super PAC, yes if it is a super PAC. Candidate, what candidate they identified, and if they supported or opposed them, and that's column F. The party, state, and then the total spent on that candidate in the primary. Followed by the result. And the candidate identifier at the end is just how we were tracking them through our system. So that's probably not as useful for you. But it's really good to drill down if you want the details from a certain organization. You know, start on the org chart, see the big picture, and then you can look up any particular organization and see where they spent their money, what candidates they invested in, and if they won or lost. So I think it's a good thing to hold on to later for a reference as well. I'm just briefly going over the stories we did. We did the original story with the raw percentages, and that story is still up, and we've updated it as races get called.
We just updated it this morning, as a matter of fact.
Yes, we did. The North Carolina race that was lagging behind got called. So we have fresh data today. Everything's been rerun. And then my colleague Anu made a great story about 2/3 of outside spending backing losing candidates. We also did a visual, which you can see on the slide. It's called Seeing the Return on Investment. And it's a chart form of the results we got. We also have the promo for today's webinar, along with a lot more in-depth talk about the methodology. And that link is with the buyer's remorse. And then today we published the Congress, House, and Senate ROI breakdowns. So that's also available. And I'm going to hand it over to Anu to go over some great story ideas.
This is the story that we did this morning, that Lindsay did. It's not up on the screen yet. It should be in a moment. Okay. And here you can see, this is what Lindsay talked about right now. We looked at how American Crossroads, some of the 30 top super PACs or outside.
Wrong link there. Let me send you today's link. That's the original story.
Oh, this is the original story. Sorry. This is the one which includes the presidential spending also. So if you look at this, you'll see that American Crossroads, which was one of the top spenders, their return on investment was 1.29 if you look at presidential spending, House and Senate together. But if we look at the other story, which does not include the presidential spending, it looks a little different. So you have 1.29, which is presidential, House, and Senate, and then it goes up for if you look at just Congress together. And one of the reasons we did this was because some of the groups were upset with us because they claimed it wasn't a right way to look at it. But for the way we looked at it was we put everything together, but we also removed the House and Senate spending later on to give a better picture of what was going on. How do I go back to Ready Talk?
One of the things, this is Kathy Kiley from the other side of the table here, and I just wanted to add that we felt we wanted to look at the overall picture. Obviously, the presidential race is very important, and a lot of groups, particularly on the Republican side, one of the reasons they had such poor returns on investment was the huge bets they made on the presidential race and lost. So we did think it would be interesting to remove those numbers and see did the numbers change significantly for the groups when you just looked at their performance in House and Senate races.
And one of the things that I'd like to point out is if you go back and look at some of the work we did in 2010, after the 2010 elections, at that time we found that the Republican groups had actually fared much better than what they have today. So one of the things that we might do, and it could be a good story idea for anybody out there interested in this, is to go back and look how these groups had fared in 2010. And if you see the link, we have links there which go back to our data from 2010, which you can use to do a comparison. So like American Crossroads had a 10% ROI this time, but last time they did much better. They had 54%, and Crossroads did even better than that. So this is just to have a comparative view of how the same groups did last time. Of course, not every group was present as super PACs or others. So it might be, you probably can't do it for all the groups. Another interesting thing that we're encouraging people to look at is looking at different state data. So if you can look at your state delegation, for example. So this slide has a link. If you see the state delegation part, which is highlighted, that's a link to a page that will give you all the raw data for various states. So you'll have all the House and Senate candidates spending in one spreadsheet. And you can quickly match that with the ROI data, see which person won or lost, and what their return on investment was per candidate per group. And another way of looking at this data could also be via the groups that were playing a part in the election. So we've highlighted about 30 of the top groups, but it might happen that American Crossroads did not spend in the state election or delegation or the member of Congress you were interested in. So you can cull down the data by the specific group and go at it that way, which is also going to be an interesting trend. But moving on to more than just the ROI part, these are just a couple of ideas that we've been mulling with also and think can be interesting to look at in the future. One is, what are super PACs going to be doing in the future? There have already been stories, and New York Times and Politico has been reporting on this, that a couple of them are going to start lobbying or working with lobbying conglomerates to kind of push their agenda. We haven't seen as yet any specific documents come through as part of our registration tracker, which is another tool that the reporting group maintains, which tracks new registrations for lobbying. So we've been looking at that fairly often, and we haven't noticed any specific thing, but it's something that can happen and has been reported that some groups are considering it. Couple of other things to keep your eyes on would be, what are these super PACs that have millions sitting on their desk? What are they going to be doing with all this money? There is no apparent regulation of what they're supposed to do or not do with this money. They are free to give it to charity, they can just hold on to it, or they can buy an airplane, anything. So it'll be interesting to see how they're spending all this money. The reporting group is going to be tracking all of this, so please come back and check back on our site to see if there's any new data. New super PAC data is going to come in December 6th. That is going to be all the filings that will be reported between October 17th and through the election day. So that's the latest reports that will come in on December 6th, and we plan to look at that and present it on our site also. And then, of course, later in December and in January, the super PACs will file their final reports. That's their monthly disclosure. And what's going to be really interesting to see in the December 6th reports, as well as the end of the month, is are there any new donors, new big donors that come up very close to the election that we didn't know about, that they existed till after the election. So that's going to be a really interesting thing that we're going to keep tabs on. I'm going to open up the presentation to any questions that you may have, and let Kathy take over.
Okay, well, hearing none, I will just talk a little bit about some story ideas that you might be able to do. One of the things I said in the chat is that one reason we focused on general election spending is that if you try to include primary spending, and you're trying to do that for a range, the level that we're doing it at, which is a national level, and talking about thousands and thousands of committees and many, many candidates, it's very difficult to go back and look and see how spending shifted from the primary. So, for example, we all know that there was a very competitive race for the Republican presidential nomination, and these Republicans were bashing each other during the primary, quote-unquote primary and caucus season. And then when it was all over and Mitt Romney emerged as the winner, everybody pretty much consolidated behind him. So that means that there were committees who were bashing Romney on behalf of some other presidential candidate in the spring, and then shifted allegiances in the fall. And we just felt that it would be way too complicated to try to capture that on a national level. But I think for those of you who are looking at regional or statewide or even, you know, a metropolitan area, this would be a really interesting way to look at this data. And you might include the primary numbers and just say, if you just have a handful of candidates or one or two races that you're looking at, you could really trace, and this would be also a great thing for data visualization, to see how loyalty shifted and to see where money shifted. Did people, did you see a drop-off of enthusiasm by some of the big spending groups who were very active in the primary and then maybe disappeared or didn't give so much in the general election? It's also a great way to sort of highlight the hypocrisy of politics, where people passionately say, this guy could never win in the spring, and then when it turns out that person is the nominee, suddenly they become one of the heroes of all time. So that's just a way that I think you can take this data or take this idea and apply it on a local level, and in some ways go deeper and further than we were able to on a national level. Lindsay, can you talk a little bit about any of the warnings, pitfalls? What are the things to watch for when you're working with data like this? Is there anything that you would advise people to be careful about?
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind that there's just so many lines of data that go into them, and while we check as much as we can, always use common sense. If something doesn't make sense to you and what you know, double check it. And we do have the FEC committee IDs, so you can look that up on the FEC. If you find anything that you think is a discrepancy, please tell us and we'll fix it as soon as we can. We did a lot of data cleaning ourselves. If people had put in the wrong member ID, we went through and fixed those. If they didn't have a member ID, we assigned them. There were amendments from last year that were put in that looked like they were from this year, so we tried to account for as many of those as we could. I'm pretty solid on the data right now, but you know, there always might be something. So.
Yeah, one reason we feel quite confident about the data is that so many people who are quite powerful were angry about it. So as you can imagine, we had people on the outside scrubbing our data pretty hard too. So, and we, you know, I think that was the other thing. I think you have to be, when you're doing something like this, you have to be prepared for pushback, and you have to be open to seeing that maybe you did make a mistake. I think one of the things about working with data is, as Lindsay has said to you, it's a fantastic tool for wrangling information that otherwise you just couldn't do. It does for you a task that would be so daunting that you might not even want to take it on without the help of these data tools. On the other hand, it also means that if there's a little error in data entry, it can produce mistakes. So I think you have to be willing to look at the data, to talk to people, to go back and forth with sources, and to be willing to make changes when you feel, and not get defensive about it. But I think the result is, because we did that, I think we're quite confident of the information we have for you. But it's easy for things to get mixed up, and when you're dealing with tables this big and you're dealing with data entry, there's always the possibility of human error. So as Lindsay said, one of the things we did was, before we published, eyeball the stuff and just look at committees we knew about, that we were really familiar with, to see. We just fly spec things. We couldn't check every single entry, obviously, but to just go in and put a human eyeball on some of this stuff, and that gives you a much higher level of confidence in what you're publishing. Amy, do you want to talk about how this might be useful for groups, outside groups? I mean, we're talking mostly about reporting. Are there any, or have you gotten any feedback that might be of interest?
Sure. This is Amy. I'm the partnerships and senior manager, and I think a lot of times folks are they see this in the news and they see the analysis that Sunlight does, and they find it very interesting, but they wonder how they can use it and track the groups that they're interested in. So in the ROI piece, a lot of the comments and the feedback that I got was, oh, that's great, but what about all of the other organizations that are out there that have spent, and how effective were they? So I think there's interest in trying to figure out how other organizations can do some of the analysis that Lindsay and the reporting group has done. So if you guys have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, one of the data that would be kind of interesting to look at would be electioneering, but unfortunately you can never tell whether that's supporting or opposing. So unless you know the ideological bent of the group, or you know a particular ad that they have placed, you can't calculate the support or oppose. You can just say that they mention that candidate, so you can't approach it in the same systematic way. But in theory, you could also use the same methodology and apply that to standard PACs.
I want to, picking up on that and also elaborating on an answer that Liz gave to one of our questioners. One of the things that, this is a very murky system and it's very hard to understand. Those of you who are journalists out there like me, I'm sure your antenna twitch too. Whenever anything gets this complicated, I think somebody's trying to hide something. And they are. But what I will say is the term that Lindsay just used, electioneering, refers to those type of ads that are, they walk like a duck, they talk like a duck, but they're not considered ducks by the FEC. These are ads that say things like, are you worried about losing your health care? Tell President Obama that you're worried about losing your health care. And of course, this is put on by a group who's for Mitt Romney, but because it doesn't cross the line and say vote Mitt or vote against Barack, it's not considered a campaign ad, so it does not have to be reported to the FEC except in certain windows, which are 2 months before the general election and 1 month before a primary. So there's a lot of under the radar advertising that goes on and is harder to capture and quantify. One of the things we have done to try to do that is to create a website called politicaladsleuth.com, which is taking what we are getting from the Federal Communications Commission, which this year started requiring major broadcast outlets in major markets to file their political ads online. And we're taking that and making it searchable and sortable by committee and state and et cetera. So when you do that, you can get a sense, and this is to answer one of our chat questioners, you can get a sense, it's a rough sense, but it's a sense of how much money is being spent on advertising. And that data does include ads for electioneering, the ads that aren't reported to the Federal Election Commission. And stay tuned, we are going to have a story coming out soon that talks about how certain organizations have already begun targeting some senators who are up for re-election in 2014. So it's already started. I think they let us get our Thanksgiving turkey, and they've now restarted the campaign season. So that's just, and Anu, I see, has given you the website for Political Ad Sleuth. It's a work in progress, and one of the things that we are very anxious to get are files from markets that are not covered by the FCC order. So there are instructions on the site about how to help this out, how to help us out. This is really a crowdsourced project, very similar to Political Party Time, which some of you may have used, which tracks fundraisers. We depend on the kindness of strangers, but what we end up with is a database that I think, from a journalistic standpoint, is incredibly useful. So if we all chip in, we're going to be able to do a lot better tracking this money.
One thing I will say is that we are always available. Our communication shop is excellent, and the folks in our comms shop, some of whom are here with us today, as well as those of us in our reporting group, are always happy to help people with this data. We're happy to provide hands-on assistance, and what I would be really happy to see is links to any stories you do using this data. We would love to see where you take this. What we try to do here is provide the information to make good stories possible. So, and again, I'm talking from a reportorial bias. I think there's lots of ways to use this data that aren't just journalistic, but we would love to see where people go with this.